You're not finding yourself. You're recovering yourself. There's a difference. Finding yourself suggests you're looking for something that isn't there. But recovering yourself means something was buried. You didn't lose your authenticity. You learned to prioritize being accepted over being fully honest about what you wanted. And after doing that for long enough, you can become so good at being the version of you that everyone likes that you forget what the real you actually wants. But reclaiming your authentic self rarely happens through one dramatic decision. It happens quietly, in the small moments when you stop performing, stop seeking permission, and start listening to yourself again. Here are 8 quiet habits that may mean you're finally coming back to yourself.
One of the first signs you're becoming more yourself is that you stop explaining every little decision. You say no, and don't immediately follow it with a 5-minute explanation. You choose something different, and don't rush to convince everyone that your choice makes sense. You might even notice yourself catching that old impulse. Wait, I need to make them understand. But you let it pass. Because somewhere along the way, you may have learned that your choices were only safe when other people approved of them. So you learned to explain yourself before anyone could question you. But authenticity changes the question. Instead of asking, how do I make them understand my decision? You start asking, do I understand why I'm making it? That's a very different kind of confidence. You don't need everyone to agree with you, to know that something is right for you. And the less you perform your reasoning for other people, the more clearly you can finally hear your own.
2. You let yourself dislike things without feeling guilty. Not everything has to be your thing. You don't like the restaurant. You don't enjoy the party. You'd rather stay home. You don't care about the trend everyone else is obsessed with. And for once, you don't immediately search for a reason to change your mind. Because you realize something. A preference doesn't need a moral defense. But if you've spent years adapting yourself to other people, even having a simple preference can feel strangely uncomfortable. You learn to read the room first. What does everyone else like? Then you adjusted yourself accordingly. Not because you were fake, but because belonging mattered. And when belonging matters enough, you can start treating your own preferences like problems that need to be corrected. Maybe I should like this. Maybe I'm being difficult. Maybe everyone else knows better. So reclaiming yourself can begin with something incredibly small. Letting yourself say, actually, I don't like this. Without guilt. Without an apology. Without turning your preference into a negotiation. Because the more comfortable you become with having your own likes and dislikes, the less you need other people to validate your experience. And slowly, your preferences stop being things you hide. They become clues. Clues about who you actually are.
3. You stop watching yourself while you're living. You say something, and don't replay it 10 times later. You walk into a room, and don't immediately start wondering whether you belong there. You make a choice, without imagining how it will look from everyone else's perspective. And that's a bigger change than it seems. Because when you've spent years adapting yourself to other people, you can start living like you're constantly being watched. Not literally, but psychologically. You're monitoring your voice, your expression, your clothes, your opinions, even the amount of enthusiasm you're allowed to show. You're not just experiencing your life, you're watching yourself experience it. And that creates a strange distance between you and yourself. Because you're present in the moment, but part of you is always standing outside it, evaluating. But as you reclaim your authenticity, that distance starts shrinking. You become less interested in performing yourself and more interested in actually being yourself. You still care about other people's feelings. You still notice how you're perceived. You just don't let that perception become the mirror you use to decide who you are.
And that's when something quietly changes. You're no longer asking, how am I coming across, as often? You're finally asking, how does this actually feel to me?
4. You start saying what you actually want. Not what would make things easier for everyone else. Not what sounds impressive. Not what you're supposed to want. What you want. Maybe you want to leave early. Maybe you don't want the promotion. Maybe you'd rather spend the weekend alone. Maybe you want to change your career, even though everyone around you thinks you're making a mistake. And sometimes, the hardest part isn't making the choice. It's admitting to yourself that you want it at all. Because when you've spent years prioritizing other people's expectations, your own desires can start feeling selfish. You become so practiced at asking, what should I do? That you forget to ask, what do I actually want? But your wants aren't automatically selfish just because they're yours. They're information. They tell you what matters to you. And reclaiming yourself means becoming curious about that information again. Not obeying every impulse. Not ignoring everyone around you. Just giving your own voice a seat at the table. Your life can look completely right from the outside and still feel completely wrong from the inside.
Because you can't build an authentic life if you never let yourself choose what you actually want. 5. You become more comfortable disappointing people. Not because you stopped caring about them, but because you finally understand someone being disappointed doesn't automatically mean you've done something wrong. You say no, they get upset. You change your mind, they don't understand. You choose yourself, and someone calls you selfish. The old version of you might have immediately rushed in to fix it, explain, apologize, give in. Anything to make the discomfort disappear. Because somewhere along the way, you learn to treat other people's disappointment like an emergency. So the moment someone became unhappy with you, your attention left you and went straight to fixing them. But that's not always kindness. Sometimes it's people-pleasing, disguised as kindness. And when you reclaim yourself, you begin learning a difficult distinction. You can care about someone's feelings without taking responsibility for controlling them. They are allowed to be disappointed. You're allowed to be misunderstood. And you're still allowed to make the choice. That doesn't make you selfish. It means you're finally learning that being a good person doesn't require abandoning yourself to keep everyone else comfortable.
6. You stop performing emotions you don't actually feel. You don't fake excitement because everyone else is excited. You don't laugh when something isn't funny. You don't pretend you're okay just because being honest would make the conversation uncomfortable. And you stop forcing yourself to be grateful when what you actually feel is hurt, anger, sadness, or disappointment. At first, this can feel strangely uncomfortable because you've learned that certain emotions make you easier to love. Happiness is safe. Agreement is safe. Being positive is safe. But anger, disappointment, neediness, those might have been emotions you learned to hide. So you became good at performing the feeling that would keep the peace, instead of acknowledging the feeling that was actually there. But authenticity doesn't mean acting on every emotion you have. It means being honest enough to notice it. You can feel angry without becoming cruel. You can feel disappointed without punishing someone. You can feel sad without pretending you're fine. And when you stop fighting your own emotional reality, you stop needing a performance just to feel acceptable. You don't have to feel the right thing anymore.
7. You start choosing what feels meaningful over what looks impressive. You care a little less about what makes a good story and a little more about what makes a good life. Maybe the job sounds impressive, but leaves you empty. Maybe the relationship looks perfect from the outside, but doesn't feel like home. Maybe everyone expects you to chase more money
more status, more achievement. And you're starting to realize you don't actually want the life that comes with it. That can be unsettling. Because when you've spent years building an identity around other people's expectations, success becomes something you can display. A title, a salary, a lifestyle, a relationship. Something people can look at and say, you're doing well. But eventually, you start asking a much harder question. Would I still want this if nobody ever saw it? That's where authenticity gets real. Because some of the things you've been chasing may have never been your dreams. They may have simply been proof that you were doing life correctly. Reclaiming yourself means creating a different scoreboard. One based less on how impressive your life looks and more on whether it actually feels like yours. Because a life that earns everyone's approval can still feel completely foreign to the person living it.
8. You become more comfortable being misunderstood. This might be the quietest sign of all. You make a choice, and someone doesn't understand it. You change, and someone says, "You've changed." You set a boundary, and they decide you're selfish. You stop playing a role they've known you by, and suddenly, they don't know what to do with you. The old instinct is to explain, to prove your intentions, to make them see the version of you that you know is real. But eventually, you stop. Not because their opinion means nothing, but because you finally understand that being understood by everyone is impossible.
Some people only understand the version of you that benefited them. Some only recognize the version of you they were comfortable with. And sometimes explaining yourself over and over isn't communication anymore. It's self-abandonment, trying to earn permission to be who you already are. So you let them misunderstand. You let the silence exist. You let someone have the wrong story about you, without rushing to rewrite it. And that's when you realize how much freedom you've gained. You no longer need everyone to agree with your identity to feel secure in it. Because the goal was never to become someone everyone understands. It was to become someone you no longer have to abandon.
Maybe reclaiming yourself doesn't feel like becoming a completely different person. Maybe it feels much quieter than that. You stop explaining. You stop pretending. You stop chasing approval for every decision. You start noticing what you actually like, what you actually want, what you actually feel. And slowly, the distance between the person you show the world and the person you are alone starts to disappear. Because authenticity isn't about becoming someone new. It's about removing everything you learned to become, just to be accepted. And maybe that's why the process can feel uncomfortable at first. You're not losing yourself. You're losing the version of yourself that was built around everyone else's expectations. So if you've been noticing these changes in yourself lately, don't rush to become who you think you should be next.